Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, bestie, the world's a better place because you're in it. You see what happens when you subscribe? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. On this episode, we talked to Kimberly Strong, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Con Ed. She has a really interesting background. She has been in this game and seen a lot, and she's built a really cool program at Con Ed. We talk about leveraging peer groups to push ethical initiatives forward. We talk about how to be more effective and how to build a program in this new era that we're stepping into. Hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
How's it going? Welcome to the Ethics Experts.
Thank you.
So really excited to get you on. You've had a really cool career, and I think you have a really cool perspective. And when we were talking in the pre-show, someone said, hey, check out this compliance thing. So tell us about how you kind of launched into this whole game.
I was in-house counsel and was doing litigation, labor and employment, and my general counsel at the time literally left me a message on my desk saying, hey, come talk to me about this ethics and compliance thing. I'm sure it's not going to take up very much of your time. And that was 25 years ago, and this is now what I do full time. And we're still friends. I'm still friends with him.
Okay, so that didn't burn the bridge, I guess, huh?
Didn't burn the bridge, no.
You found a home in this space.
Right, absolutely.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about, we had a really fun pre-show, and we almost could have just recorded the pre-show because that itself was a podcast. But something you said that really kind of stuck with me was you had you had a law degree and you had an undergrad degree in communication. Right. Talk to me a little bit about how those things complemented, or how those kind of different fields were really complementary in building programs and driving, ethics and compliance forward.
So in my undergraduate degree, which was in industrial communications, you're really thinking about the organization as an entity and how can you be effective within the organization and all aspects of marketing and management and employee development. And after getting my undergrad, I worked for a few years and then I went to law school and I became a trial lawyer. And I kept seeing as in-house counsel repetitive behavior that was ending up in litigation. And that's frustrating because litigation is time consuming, it's expensive, it's distracting for the organization. And so when I started to move into ethics and compliance, I realized, wow, here's a solution where you can actually get back upstream in the organization, change people's behavior, affect their decision making, so they're making better decisions so they don't end up in litigation. So that's how I enjoy the marriage of the two fields that I've studied.
So when did you make that connection? Was it just when you were kind of doing all that litigation work?
More, I think when I started evolving and working in the area of ethics and compliance, because it was, a source of frustration as a business person being in the law department and saying, wow, we're spending a lot of money on this and we keep doing it over and over again. How can we stop that? How can we keep this from recurring?
Yeah, how can we sort of preventatively change those behaviors so that we're not just in the morass of running through the mud of litigation or whatever these negative outcomes are.
Right.
You said that I think it was in that job that your company kind of got into some issues and you were interviewed by the DOJ or the FBI or something. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that was such a lesson for you about this job has some risks that maybe some other positions don't have?
Right. So I was the director of ethics and compliance when I was with Quest Communications. And in the aftermath of 9/11, there were a number of corporations, Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, that came under investigation for financial accounting irregularity. And that included the company that I was working for at the time, Quest Communications. And that proved to be a professional moment, which I'm not interested in repeating, where the United States government shows up and they want to know why things went wrong. And so you get to sit across from the Department of Justice and the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission and explain what was happening in the company or what was not happening in the company. And ultimately, we did have members of the leadership team go to jail, which was also an interesting experience.
Yeah.
And so, you learn from that. But I think that is one of the risks associated with being a chief ethics and compliance officer is that you could find yourself in a situation where the government wants to know what went wrong. And you're in a very visible position where you're supposed to prevent and detect criminal conduct and promote an organizational culture that values ethics and compliance with the law. That's what's in the U.S. sentencing guidelines. That's sort of your charter. And when things don't go so well, you're questioned about that.
So what advice would you give somebody who's kind of considering getting into ethics and compliance, given the stakes are, I mean, there's so much opportunity, there's so much interesting work in this space, there's so much impact that you can have, but there's also this other kind of bucket of, I don't know, it's just higher stakes. So what advice would you give somebody who's thinking, to somebody who's thinking about this path?
Well, there's the good and the bad and the ugly, and the ugly is when things don't go well. And the good is when you're, what we think about being in flow, and you're in an organization and you're making a difference and you're helping the organization be successful. That's the joyful, fun part of the job. I think when you're looking at this as a profession, you need to think about, are you taking on this role and responsibility in an organization where you're aligned with the leadership team? Are you aligned with the values of the organization? And can you be successful in that kind of position? And that's where you realize you can actually make a difference, because the organization wants you to bring that perspective to the employees and to what the organization is doing.
You mentioned that your experience at Quest really kind of gave you a different level of confidence to ask for and look for circumstances within your next job that would lead to more success for you. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You said that, I think you said something about, you were very clear about what your intentions were and what your angle was when you were looking for that next lily pad after Quest. So talk to me through, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you ended up constructing in terms of your non-negotiables or whatever. What were you looking for, and where did that confidence come from to say, I'm this and I'm not this? You know what I'm saying? Because I think a lot of people, especially when they're looking for a job, there's almost a desire, or there's at least a temptation to be kind of all things to all people. And I think you kind of can't be all things to all people. You're just going to be lukewarm. And I think it takes a certain confidence to be able to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm standing clearly on this side of the line. So talk to me through that kind of process.
I do think professionally people need to develop sort of what is their philosophy, what is their approach, and be able to articulate that in the interview process. Because if you're not philosophically aligned with the leadership and where they want you to go, nobody's going to be happy. You're going to be unhappy. They're going to be unhappy. It's a little bit like dating. It's not you, it's me. I have to go, whatever it is. And it's really you. But that's, that's that part of it. So, some of the things that I would inquire about is, what do you already have in place? What is the budget? I was in one interview where I asked about the budget, and the person who was interviewing me said, well, I'm hoping that if we hire somebody, the CEO will agree to fund it. I'm like, okay, probably not where I want to be right now. If you're not actually committed to, financially supporting it. I think you also have to ask about, what else is going on in the organization? Where, what is their commitment to safety? What is their commitment to regulatory compliance? Has there been any other issues within the corporation? So you can start to frame a perspective of where the organization is already and what their level of commitment is, and then decide if that fits with where you want to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about at some degree is this long-term view, because you can just get the job, you can get the date, but if you don't go through that hard work of making sure that we look at the world the same way, then the marriage isn't going to work, right? I mean, there has to be a high degree of ethos overlap, I think, in any relationship for that relationship to withstand the test of time. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So figuring that out with the marriage that is a job, I think, is really important. And I think I don't know if it's just interview techniques or it's just the anxiety that comes with trying to get a new job. I just find a lot of people don't have the confidence to be as clear about what it is they exactly want, And
I think the other challenge is you can be there and you can be talking with the person who's in the seat today, and you can believe that you're philosophically aligned. And then within some period of time, maybe a year or two, leadership changes. And now you have a new group of leaders in place, and you might not be philosophically aligned with them. They may have, different values. I think it's important for ethics and compliance officers to understand the concept of idiosyncratic credits. And that's this theory in social psychology that you have to demonstrate enough alignment and enough connection and enough competence so that when you have to have a difficult conversation, people are willing to listen to you.
Yeah, there's some equity in the bank already. You've already kind of you made some deposits already.
Right. Because you will definitely have to draw upon those at some point in time. You will make someone uncomfortable, no doubt.
What is that term called?
Idiosyncratic credits.
Idiosyncratic credits. Okay. And so how do you start to accumulate those credits?
I think you come into an organization or you're with a leadership team, you find out what their values are. How are we already aligned? How can I build on what you already have in place? Because at some point in time, I know I'm going to have to deviate from that. I'm going to have to come and have a difficult conversation about maybe somebody who's very senior and very well liked, and now they've done something that you really don't want them to do. Or there's a process or a decision being made in the company that perhaps is a little too risky, and you need to at least raise awareness about that. So you're looking for ways to make sure that you can contribute, make sure that you can demonstrate that you understand the values, make sure that people see you as a competent partner, so that when you have to deviate from that social structure, you're listened to.
Is that framework that you just described, is that just natural for you? Is that like a natural thing? Like, do you just naturally kind of see that the world that way, or do you feel like that's a skill that you built?
I think it's a skill that you have to build, and sometimes people are willing to work with you on that, and there's other times where people will see the title or the job category, and maybe they're not philosophically aligned with what ethics and compliance should be in the organization, and as we would say in the South, they don't want to neighbor with you. They just don't. They really don't want to have you present and have you involved. And you have to think about, well, what does that mean for me personally and professionally if I'm with a leadership team that really doesn't want me to do what I should be doing?
So the nature of these idiosyncratic credits, is it just relationship building? Is it just showing yourself as competent and trustworthy and like somebody that's on the team? Like, what are the characteristics of these credits? Do I sound like an idiot?
No, and I'm not a social psychologist, so I won't get it perfect.
Okay.
But I
we both sound like idiots. That's fine.
It's one of those things where you sort of know if you're building trust. I think that trust is a big part of it. And when someone is willing to welcome you in and say, hey, I have this issue that's happening in my group. Could you or someone from your team come and talk to us about it? Or we're facing this challenge and we're having a difficulty, and can I just speak to you? Sometimes people just want to speak to you informally in the hallway. That's sort of how you know. But if you can also find an opportunity where it's like, look, we're getting ready to take on this new opportunity within the organization, let's make sure we're doing it the right way. We'd love to come and talk with your team about that. So it's adding value. It's showing alignment with the culture. It's showing alignment with the business needs. It's making sure that people understand that you're loyal and you're committed to the success. You're not just looking for an aha, I got you, I want to punish you. You don't want to be about crime and punishment. You want to be about being able to be synchronous with the organization.
You've talked a lot about instincts, and that we have to trust our instincts. And you were telling me the story back to the Quest days where you kind of had this, this is my word, but some naivete coming out of, law school when you read these case studies about ethical behavior and all these kinds of things. And then you're sort of, cast into the cold pool that is the workforce, and you start to see things that like kind of don't add up. I went through a similar thing where I was so excited coming out of undergrad, because I read all these case studies, and I grew up in a small business, and I was just like so excited to roll my sleeves up and get out there and see how like proper business is done. And so I started doing these engagements at KPMG, doing kind of like consulting work. And I was just like, what the heck? Businesses are, these massive companies that are just, I don't want to say rotting from the inside, but they were a lot closer to the small business that I grew up in than my sort of like naive picture of what a proper business was. And so that was a real eye opener for me because, everything is not run by the book as I thought it would when I got out into the real world. Walk me through that kind of experience and walk me through the development of your confidence to rely on those instincts, because many times you can, even if you can't put your finger on it, that there's something wrong. There's some vibe that's not what it should be. And that's usually something that we should focus some effort on kind of exploring,
So we talked a little bit about how like you go to the movies and you see scenarios played in the movies and then they wrap up within a couple of hours, or you read the ethics case in law school and you wonder like, how did that happen? How did that person get there? And you're in a situation where you have people who are very well educated, they're financially well off, they went to top tier schools, but they have perhaps a moral flexibility that allows them to see things in a way that are not necessarily going to align with the laws, rules, and regulations that we apply to our businesses. And I think that's hard when you're in that situation and you want to believe that you have that connectivity, that you're working for good people and they're making good decisions. And yet there's a part of you, there's a gut reflex that's going, I don't think this is so great. And I think you have to learn to listen to that gut. Don't discount it. I don't think people necessarily have to be paranoid, but you're an adult, right from wrong, what should and shouldn't happen. And if you find yourself in a situation where you don't believe that you're aligned, you may have to leave. And I think in this profession, for people who choose to be in this profession, you need to be prepared to do that. You need to have that 3 to 6 months of household expenses. And if you have a partner, talk with your partner, like, well, how would we work this if we had to live on one income for a period of time? And that's real. You may have to exit the organization if you think there's things happening that shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, is this a job or is this a purpose? Like, if it's a life purpose, then you're going to commit to doing it with a different level of, I don't know, acuity or like respect than you would if it's just like a job, And I think to your point, the further around the curve we can see, and the more sort of potential like decision paths or potential paths that something can go down that we've considered beforehand, it really does give us a leg up in kind of like maintaining our own integrity. Because I think if we fall on the side of the line where it's like, okay, well, this is my job, not that like my purpose in life is to make the world a better place. If it's just a job, well, then it's easier to absorb some of that moral flexibility when you're, in the gray, I just think it takes a certain like fortitude, maybe for lack of a better term, a certain fortitude to be able to say, this ain't for me. I'm not going to thrive here. There's something better for me out there. That's a confidence in self. That's an adherence to a clearly articulated purpose that I think a lot of folks don't do that pre-work to like really develop. And sometimes they find themselves in a sticky situation where they then haven't had that conversation with their partner, or they haven't, stockpiled 3 to 6 months of savings, and they're kind of in a tougher spot that causes some of that, compromise, call it.
Great. Absolutely. All that's true.
You've worked in different businesses in different industries, and I'm kind of fascinated by this sort of concept or this dynamic where all these different industries have compliance and ethics programs. Like, ethical behavior is important, I think, in all organizations. I think compliance is quality, and high quality organizations are compliant. They are ethical. They all, they on average do more of the right thing than their less ethical counterparts. But I think navigating businesses in different industries that have a different sort of regulatory load sometimes have a different like impact on the human beings in the organization. So I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on like what the different ethical or what the different expectations are of ethical behaviors in different types of companies that you've worked at, whether it's a highly regulated company or a less regulated company, and how that has sort of, soaked into the hearts and minds of the employees that live within that kind of an industry. How do you ride those different horses in an effective way? And what are you keying in on as you come into a new industry to kind of understand what the best path up the mountain is?
I think one of the things that you have to look at in any organization, whether it's regulated or unregulated, you have to look at what are the incentives that you're providing people, because human beings, they want to do well, they want to create financial value for themselves, they want to keep their jobs, they want to be able to pay their bills. So when you think about the financial incentives, you have to think about, well, are there unintended consequences here? Like if we're so focused on the stock price, and this is what we've seen historically that can happen, if a company is so focused on the stock price, then the stock doesn't keep going up in the way they want it to go. There can be an incentive internally for people to be like, oh, well, maybe we'll just cheat this one time, or we'll just cheat a little bit. The same time, we've seen situations where you have people who are in call centers. And it's like, well, I'm supposed to sell a certain number of these add-ons, and I'm not selling my number this month. So I could get a demerit. I could potentially lose my job. So I'm going to cheat just once. And then it's like, oh, you achieved that sales goal. So now we're going to raise it. So now I'm in a situation where I'm going to cheat maybe 3 or 4 times a month. Not every day, not all the time, but just enough to be able to, get the next reward and maybe keep my job. So regardless of the industry, I think one of the things companies have to look at is, what are you incentivizing people to do? And is there an unintended consequence there where people may want to do something you don't really want them to do to achieve that financial goal?
It's really hard, isn't it? It's hard to run those simulations in your mind and really figure out like, okay, if I throw this little rock in the lake, how far are these ripples really going to go? I mean, that to me is so difficult, and it's probably impossible to do if you don't understand the business.
And that's why, as ethics and compliance officers, we have helplines where hopefully you've created an environment where if something is happening that you don't want to have happen, that people will call and tell you. People are like, what keeps you up at night? Are you worried that somebody is doing something bad? And it's like, no, we have 15,000 employees. That's a city. I am confident someone is doing something I don't want them to do somewhere. And have we built enough structure where people will pick up the phone and tell us, hey, I think this isn't right. I think there's a risk associated with this. I think somebody needs to look at this. And that's part of our jobs, that we're trying to protect the assets of the corporation, the reputation of the corporation for everybody who works there, as well as the shareholders.
So if you step into an organization or you lift your eyes up from your desk and you consider your organization and it's the size of a city, and you have some indication, whether it's your gut or things you've seen, that things could be better, like how do you not get overwhelmed by the size of the city? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, how do you not fall into that apathy trap where you're like, how am I going to weed this garden? This garden is, 1,000 acres. You know what I mean?
Well, you assume that most people want to do the right thing. And if they're given the structure and the support and the resources to do that, that they are going to do the right thing. And that if you've built that loyalty and that investment, that if they see something that's going wrong, they'll tell you. So you really have to be constantly building that within your organization and making sure that when new people come into the organization, maybe from other companies where there's been other structures, other values, that they understand your values and your structure. And, I've done that a few different ways where I've had advisor networks in the organization where there's our people with full-time jobs that we pull in and we give them training and we talk to them about, how they can help instill ethics in the organization. We've also done employee-led training, which I think can move a culture faster than anything when you give your fellow employees scenarios that they can lead discussions with the people they work with every day. Is what are our ethics? What are our expectations? Do we support each other in speaking up? Those are ways where you can really start building in the city. What is the behavior that we want to see, and how do we look out for each other?
Yeah, and that approach you just said is very smart because it creates like very powerful leverage in the organization. It's not just on you to carry the weight of, the weight of the ethical world on your shoulders. You can crowdsource that a little bit and you can spread that around. And in spreading it around, to your point, hearing it from a peer is always more valuable than hearing it from some authority figure somewhere else, right? Like when I hear my daughter correct my other daughter, that's always like I feel very proud of that. And I'm also not yelling at that moment, which is great. With respect to like this tone from the top thing, which is kind of what we're talking about. Maybe it's moved from the middle, but like what role do you think we as compliance officers play in actually creating that culture of ethics? Because what I have heard a lot of people struggle with is they know that there's room for improvement in their program. There's room for improvement in their ethical culture. You know what I'm saying? It can get closer to that ideal of perfect company, whatever. But they kind of lose a little bit of traction in terms of getting endorsements from managers or from leadership. So we know tone at the top is critical. You talked a little bit about how you can leverage, peer groups or people within peer groups to help drive that message forward. But what role do you think we play in helping to activate leaders, middle managers, executives in really driving that tone from the top forward? And how do we do better at that?
I think it's creating those partnerships, making sure that at different levels of the organization, like when we have a new officer come into the company, my team and I, we meet with them, we talk about work that we have going on in the organization, what we're already doing with their team, how we can help them going forward. When we have people who are, promoted into different positions in the organization, we reach out to them. We want to make sure that they understand that we're there to partner with them. And, just that constant repetition of information, the idea that you have to tell somebody 7 times the same information, before they believe it and absorb it. We're always looking for opportunities to do that.
And is that a muscle that your team had when you joined it? Or is that a muscle that you just you feel like you have to continually build? You know what I mean? You know what I'm asking there?
It's, there was a team in place when I joined the current company where I am, and we've certainly expanded it. We've grown. We've adopted best practices from different industries and different companies. We're always looking for ways to innovate and improve. You touched on briefly about your daughters. I think that's one of the new challenges that's coming is the generational change. And yes, while you have to have tone at the top, we get a lot of our information from our peers, like in my neighborhood, if I want to know, hey, who's a good person who can come in and, do some work on my yard or my home, I'm looking to my neighbors. Who have you had a good experience with? I'm not necessarily looking for, maybe more.
The advertisement, right.
Right, the advertisements. We talk about the sage on the stage and how, the new generation that's coming in really do look at them. They look for those influencers. So I think one of the opportunities with ethics and compliance is how are you creating those influencers in the organization, or how are you finding those influencers? Because the culture is the myths and the stories and the heroes. It's what are people telling each other informally? Oh, yes. I understand that there's this formal message that's out on the website. That's our standards of business conduct. But let me tell you how we really do things here. And are those things aligned?
So those are 2 different pictures that we today hold in our minds with kind of everything, right? Like we've all been to Denny's and we've all seen a Denny's menu, and then we've all seen what the Denny's food looks like. No offense to Denny's, right? Like it looks so much better on the menu than it does when it shows up. Same thing for fast food, same thing for every product virtually, right? The Ginsu knives seem so sharp and then you get them and they're dull in a week. Okay. So we have this, and I guess I'm kind of wondering, do you think that today's generation, whoever's alive right now, do you feel like this skill is something that we have to a greater degree than generations before us? This ability to kind of see at 2 different depths of focus, okay, here's the ad, and then I'm actually looking for the truth behind it. And I guess maybe I'm answering my own question. But I remember recently seeing one of those old commercials from the 50s where there's a doctor, by the TV, and he's saying 4 out of 5 doctors smoked Lucky Strikes. And it's okay, well, those ads worked. Those ads worked on our grandparents. They're oh, I guess we should switch to Lucky Strikes because these are healthier or something, right? So how do we get better at closing that gap between the actual culture the things that's, you know, the myths and heroes and whatever you said that are coming from the mouths of our peers versus the sort of corporate mouth that's kind of, you know, espousing this sort of aspirational culture that usually is not what what people actually experience, you know?
I think in addition to looking at what's going on inside the company and making sure you're leveraging your resources, you know, we're not the only company that has what we call our Values and Action Advisor Network. Lots of companies have those. I don't think we're the only company that does employee-led training. There's lots of companies that do that. But also finding those partners in the organization, you know, whether it's, you know, HR or environmental health and safety, where you're all talking about the same message, you're just doing it from a slightly different angle. You want people to look out for each other. You want people to be respectful. You want people to be safe. You want people to make sure that they're doing the right thing in the right way. So you can leverage the partners you have in the organization so that you're coming at it, but it's essentially the same message, maybe just a little different tonality. I think the other thing that we talked about that can be a challenge is the environment outside the corporation. The environment that can exist in the society outside the corporation, whether it's domestic or international. There can be ways that, you know, people were taught in their homes of, you know, you don't speak up, you keep your head down, you know, you know, in the Northeast, we have this thing of, you know, you're not the rat. and I'm not from the Northeast. So the first time this came up, I'm looking around, I'm like, what is this rat of which you speak? I don't know what this is. And it, you know, people were like, you're asking me when I come to work to behave differently than I do in my home. You're asking me to behave differently than I've taught my children how to behave. And that's very real. And you have to be aware of that as well, is what are those pressures that exist outside the company as well as inside the company, and how are you going to address those?
You know, something you said really resonated with me, that like new generation, they like the sage on the stage. They are looking for these influencers. There are influential people throughout the organization. And to your point, it's not like the only ethical people in the company are in the ethics department. There are people throughout the company who resonate with the message that you're putting out. And to your point, they want to have whether they're in safety or they're in ops or they're in whatever, they want to have a workplace that's high integrity and that's, you know, built on respect and accountability and so forth. How do you think, you know, I love your whole program. I love the whole angle that you guys have taken and the impact that you're driving. And I think one of the biggest stoppers for ethics and compliance departments right now is exactly something that you guys are leveraging, which is like activating other people in the company. We can't sing we're not going to be able to, with our own voice, sing a song out across 15,000 people for them all to learn it. But if everyone's hearing the same song, not just from me singing it, but from their peers and from their middle manager and the CEO singing it, well, now the odds of them learning that song and singing it and harmonizing with us is obviously a lot higher. So if a company is starting at a spot where they're like, man, I really want to start activating, you know, I want to get kind of a compliance champions network going, kind of like what you guys have, where do you get started? Do you just kind of throw some chum in the water and see what fish come? Do you start asking other managers, like, who are some people that this really resonates with? Like, how do you actually start to get it off the ground? Because in my experience, just starting always seems like the biggest thing or the hardest thing, you know?
So we start with our leaders. We start with our officers throughout the company, and we ask them to help identify those people in the organization who are already sort of viewed as those natural leaders, or maybe they're in leadership positions and the senior leadership wants to give them a growth opportunities. Like, we want to make you visible, because that's leadership as well. You know, having informal leadership and being able to influence your peers demonstrates a level of leadership where you don't have the title, but you have the ability to affect an organization. So we get started with who in the organization would our leadership look to and say, we think these are individuals who can carry this message forward. And that's how we identify them.
So once they're identified, then it's just a matter of bringing them into the fold, so to speak.
We have an orientation. We have quarterly meetings with them. We have regularly touch bases with them. You know, we don't just bring them in and say, okay, we want you to go out and talk about conflicts of interests or cybersecurity or whatever the topic happens to be. And we recognize that they're not experts, but they are a voice that can help carry the message forward. And we give them resources to be able to do that. And, I have a very small core team. We talk about being the hub to the spoke and the spokes in the wheel. And we leverage that. We give them the resources to be able to go out and talk about what is a conflict of interest in their part of the organization.
And what have been, I'm sure there's myriad benefits from this, but what are some of the ones that you've seen that you can really hang your hat on? Like, how have you seen the impact from this, like, employee-led, chorus?
So I'm not going to take full credit for this because I have some wonderful peers in the organization who
you're probably going to hear this, which is smart of you.
Who are helping to carry this message forward. But one of the things that we've seen this last year, which I think is really kind of an interesting cultural shift, is we have employees reaching out to us on behalf of others. So, you talk about, maybe I'm uncomfortable speaking up about myself, or, I don't want to be retaliated against. But we're starting to see employees reach out and say, I was in this meeting, I observed this conduct, or I observed this conversation, or this happened, and it wasn't directed at me, it was directed at someone else. And I think someone needs to go check on this person or check into this. That's really powerful.
Totally.
Where it's like, I have now adopted this idea of I need to have a questioning attitude. I need to absorb these messages about, safety and respect and integrity in the workplace. And maybe it's not me that's the subject of it, but I'm willing to speak up on someone else's behalf. That's pretty significant.
It's so significant. And I mean, there's just, like you said, in a 15,000 person city, you can guarantee that there's somebody doing something that they shouldn't be doing, to your point. And so there's so much risk intelligence in an organization, and we need more of it, because I think, everybody I talk to in this space, smart people who care, they want to leave the world better, they want to fix problems, they, what I'm saying? They want high integrity organizations. And many times they just need to know about something to kind of take action. So the gap to me is not like a wiring within ethics and compliance people, because they seem like they want to do stuff. It's a gap in the level of risk intelligence that we're gathering from the workforce. And when you have people speaking up on behalf of somebody else, that potential group has so much opportunity in it, because the number one thing that's preventing someone from speaking up in general is what? It's the fear of retaliation. Well, I'm not really scared of getting retaliated against when I'm speaking up on behalf of somebody else. So I'm just saying, like, a targeted campaign toward more of those kinds of reports, I think probably has like a lot of knock-on effects for, supercharging the velocity of your ascension toward this, culture of integrity that is the ideal.
And we've also been using, in our organization, Dr. Mary Gentile's Giving Voice to Values.
Cool.
That takes the assumption that people know right from wrong. They can recognize you've given enough training, they can spot the issue, they know whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. What they now have to get comfortable with is having that difficult conversation. Like, how do I approach that? How do I approach someone and say, hey, this is really awkward. Would it surprise you to know that this made me uncomfortable, or I have a concern about this, using those I statements. Because you're raised in your home where your parents tell you, you put your napkin in your lap and this is how you use your fork. But when you come to the workplace, it's like, I don't know that I'm prepared to have difficult conversations. So we've been trying to normalize that as a part of being in the workplace. This is how you have a difficult conversation. These are the resources that you have available to you. I had many years ago, I was working in a multinational setting, and I had a very generous person from the UK come to me and say, you don't speak English with the right accent. And what you're trying to do in these other countries in Europe, there's resistance because you literally have an American accent. Let me help you. So I've used that as a little bit of an analogy, is sometimes you need to find somebody who has that idiosyncratic credit that maybe you don't have, who can have that challenging conversation with that individual where they will be heard, where you may not be heard. And that's all part of the process that we've been trying to build with people in the organization, is look for those resources that can help you have that difficult conversation.
So let's hear it. Let's hear your British accent. It sounds like you had a built-in tutor.
No. I handed it off. I was like, go for it.
Yeah, they're like, when you say color, that doesn't sound like there's a U in that word.
Right.
So like when we're, it's kind of my thesis that we're stepping into this new era in ethics and compliance. I think the next 10 years are going to look way different than the last 10 years. But I think that's going to take us doing things different. Like what got us here isn't going to get us there. What do you think that next evolution is? And what do you think the skills that the, next gen compliance officer needs to develop in order to navigate and be impactful in this new era?
I think if you haven't developed it already, you have to listen. You can't just be the person who's going into the room and saying, I have the answers. You have to be listening to really what's happening in the organization and adapt to what's happening in the organization. We're telling people all the time, speak up, speak up, speak up. But have we really prepared ourselves to be ready to listen? Are you ready to listen when those difficult conversations happen? And I think that's one of the shifts that's going to happen in the profession is you're hopefully going to create a workforce that's willing to tell you when risks are occurring. Are you now building on the other side of the organization where the organization is prepared to take that in and adjust to it and adapt to it? So I think that's one of the opportunities, and I think this is going to be driven by the new generations that are coming into the workforce.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you said something else that I think kind of relates to this. You said that people have to believe the information that they're getting from you is true, right? So how do we ensure that like we're being transparent and credible and that the information we want people to act upon is like, digested, like they have to eat what they have to eat what we're serving if they're going to do something, So how do we do better at that? And where have you seen the lack of that going well cause problems?
I think it's in those situations where you as the leader don't deal with the hard issue that's in front of you. And sometimes that's when you have somebody who is clearly behaving badly and is not aligned with the values that you have espoused. And people are looking around and they're saying, well, you keep saying this is our standard, but then that's happening over there and you're not dealing with it.
Right.
So what is it? Is it the 99% of us continue to adopt this particular standard, but that person gets to get away with it? I mean, I think that's one of those elements of, even if it's somebody that you really like, that you think has done well, but now perhaps has fallen into a situation where they're not behaving the way you need them to, are you going to be prepared to address that? And when people see that consistency with the message that you're living it, they're going to understand that this is really what we want you to do, and they're going to adopt it as well.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where like whatever we're presented with, there's this sort of subconscious algorithm that runs in our mind where we're like, is this real or not? Does this matter or does this not matter? And we've gotten so many platitudes and we've read so many, glossy codes of conduct with all the diverse pictures and everybody smiling and stuff, where we kind of like, we're like, can I actually build a house on this? Or is this, is this solid ground or is this just sand? You know what I mean?
Right. Yes.
I'd love to talk a little bit about your experience, with the DPA and with monitors, and how let's just talk about that experience, because I think, based on our pre-conversation, that was a very monumental thing that you went through, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and then how that has sort of shaped your approach to compliance today.
I would say that I don't want to do it again. Definitely don't want to do it again. I mean, when you end up in a monitor with a monitor and a deferred prosecution agreement, is as professional and as gracious as the person that I worked with was. It's still a difficult, challenging situation. You're very aware of the fact that this person is reporting to the court or reporting to the government, and they're watching you, and that you can't sort of maybe make the changes and do the things that you want to do because you're being held accountable to an external standard. So you're not really in control anymore. So, the advantage of doing the right thing so that you don't end up in a situation where you have a DPA or a monitor is that you have the freedom to make decisions on behalf of the organization, hopefully the right decisions on behalf of the organization, rather than having to deal with a third party who wants to know, why are you making that decision? Why are you making that change? Is that the most effective change? Or telling you how you're going to get things done. So you've touched on two major life events in my profession that I'm not inclined to want to do again.
So what's so painful about the DPA? Is it just that it's so high stakes and there's just like an undercurrent of anxiety through it? Or is it that like they're telling you to do things that you think are stupid things to do? And I'm not talking about your particular one. I know you had a good relationship with your monitor and stuff like that. But, we're just kind of talking about this third party or this external force that are holding us to a standard. And by their nature, they're not going to be as intimate with the business and how things actually work and what's in place and so forth. So, like, what is the pain of it? Like, again, this is maybe a stupid question because it's probably very painful and there's a lot of stress and a lot of things to do and stuff like that. But I'm just trying to kind of deconstruct it a little bit,
Well, you're on probation. You've essentially agreed that you're a convicted felon, for lack of a better, you've said, I'm willing to accept this period of probation in lieu of actually going through the process of being convicted and sentenced. And you're being watched. And anything that could go wrong in the organization, whether it's related to exactly why you were on probation to start with, it has the potential to show that the organization is still not committed to doing the right thing. So you don't even necessarily always get the latitude of it was just a mistake. Something just happened. It went haywire because you're under this higher level of scrutiny because up until this point, someone, a third party, usually someone in the government, has believed that the company has existed in a way that wasn't committed to doing the right thing. So now you're in this period of time where if more mistakes continue to happen, it reinforces that perception already. So right. It's restraining. I think it's restraining an organization. It's, allows people to, in some ways, not maybe perhaps be as creative as they could be in their problem solving because they don't want to take on the risk of something going wrong. It's not a great time.
Yeah.
I've got peers out there who are like, no, it is not a great time.
Exactly. Everybody's like, yeah, exactly. So like when the DPA ends, what is that like? Is that anticlimactic or is that like a celebration?
Well, you hope that you've been successful, that you've demonstrated that you're a good corporate citizen, that you're not at risk to the shareholders, you're not at risk to the American public who are investing in the company, that you're committed to doing all the right things to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Were there things in the DPA that, or were there things that the DPA allowed you to do that you were having trouble getting done before? Like, are there some positive externalities from the DPA, or is it hard to? Or am I kind of saying like, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play?
I have to admit it was quite a while ago, so I'm not as intimately familiar with all the aspects of it. I don't recall it at that level.
We'll just make something up then.
Just making something up. I don't recall there being anything in that agreement that we weren't prepared to do or that we couldn't do or that was onerous. No, necessarily. I think it was just more of the fact that, you're going to be watched and someone's going to be writing a report about you periodically and, providing it to the court and the government as to how you're doing. They're your probation officer.
I've just heard that some people have said, there were some initiatives that I was trying to get done that weren't getting the budget or they weren't getting the attention that once I had the DPA involved and we had this monitor involved, it now, just got more attention from the leadership whose endorsement was necessary to get those kinds of things done.
Yes, that can absolutely happen. I've talked to people where, yes, you get perhaps a bigger, more open checkbook as a result of that.
Have you found that having been through a DPA, that's allowed you to have maybe some new sort of persuasion colors to paint with when you're trying to get something done as like sort of a cautionary tale that your current company should avoid? Like, do you leverage that in like an implicit way or an explicit way in any kind of a way?
I don't think for people who haven't been through it that they necessarily believe it will happen to them.
Yeah.
So I don't know that someone else's lived experience can necessarily be leveraged to influence, someone in the future.
That's probably right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody who smokes, they know that, they've seen somebody in an iron lung,
Yep. It's not going to happen to me.
So as we sort of get toward the end here, this was a lot of fun. I had really high hopes for this conversation, and you knocked it out of the park. So you can go into the weekend knowing that you hit a home run. I'm really interested in this concept of the disconnect between compliance, ethics and compliance folks in terms of like what we view as the most impactful thing to drive an ethical company forward, and the role that ethics and compliance has in ultimately like increasing enterprise value for a company. I'm interested in that understanding that exists, I think, within ethics and compliance, and how it doesn't exist to the same degree among leadership. I think I don't think that you can grab a CEO who would say, yeah, I don't care about ethics. No one would say that. Even the ones who actually don't wouldn't say that. And yet there still seems to be a disconnect with respect to like, what I call kind of light bulbs on at the top. I think some leaders, they have the light bulb on and they know, man, an ethical culture is going to lead to a ton of positive externalities, and that's worth investing in, and it's worth giving, more resources, let's say, to that ethics and compliance department. And then there's other folks who deal with leadership where they really feel like they're hitting up against the wall and their wheels are spinning, and the ethics and compliance department is really just, like a bumper sticker on the car. So I'm interested in how we can, not just have to sit back and wait until more people who, quote unquote, get ethics ascend to positions of power, but rather how we can accelerate that change by changing the perspective of those leaders right now whose light bulbs won't be on. Do you understand what I'm kind of getting at?
Yeah, that's a complex issue. I think it goes back to, can you be patient enough to wait for that?
Yeah, right.
Or, do you see enough in the organization that you can build on and you can leverage and you can help focus what the organization is doing? Interestingly, one of the things that we're seeing now is in our Values and Action Advisor program, some of the people who were those advisors are now rising up into leadership positions.
Cool.
So we had the opportunity to influence them, when they were at a certain level of their career, and now they're coming into those leadership positions in the organization.
I mean, that's so powerful. That's got to be wildly different.
Yes, it's great. It's terrific. I think we already had a really strong culture of commitment, and that's certainly demonstrated in a lot of ways throughout the organization. I think for those folks who are in companies where they don't feel like they have that support, maybe you have to sit quietly and decide whether or not that's where you want to be spending your time and energy, or what levers can you pull? Where are the bright spots? Where are the influencers that you can draw upon and partner with? It's a tougher challenge. It's a higher hill to climb. You just have to decide what to do.
I guess any house you move into, you're probably going to do some stuff to change that house. And I think what you're talking about is really like an awareness for like, does this house, is this house going to be a money pit, or is it does it have good bones, and I can sort of, deal with the things that don't sort of meet my standard in the meantime as I sort of get those things fixed.
Right. Do you want something that is already fully baked, or can you take on a fixer-upper and do the work that you want to do? Depends on where you are in your life and where you are in your career.
Yeah, and how many months of savings you have. So last question, let's hop in our time machine. We're going to go and find a young Kimberly, we're going to find a young you, and you're going to give her some advice you wish you had sooner. What would that advice be?
Trust your instincts. You have good instincts, and find those people around you who have shared values with you, and work with them, and enjoy what you're doing. Have fun.
Love it. What? That is a real one. My dad said that to me my whole life. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right. And I would always kind of be like, yeah. And like recently I've really realized, like, if you're not having fun with what you're doing, you should probably be doing something else, or you need to change your mindset or something. I don't know. But like, if you're not having fun, I don't know. That seems like such a waste of a life,
Yep.
All right, Kimberly. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Ethics Experts. This was really phenomenal. You are an absolute master, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.